Espionage, a complicated sounding word if I do say so myself. So here's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. Quote, the practice...
Wait, now, you just put on sunglasses.
Quote, the practice of spying or using spies to obtain information about the plans and activities, especially of a foreign government or competing company. Espionage is not where we need to stop. The Espionage Act became a thought almost 87,600 minutes after the start of World War I, which is about 2 months, when the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, decided that a law needed to be passed to protect the United States against invasive acts of the opposing government, which basically means that the United States didn't want German spies getting all up in their business and especially did not want one individual exposing that information to the public. But if I'm being completely honest, this was not the first Espionage Act. The first one was almost 150 years earlier in 1789. But this one had obviously expired and needed some updating in order to fit the guidelines that had to be set in place. So, in June of 1917, the Espionage Act was created. But this was only considered a law until May 16th, 1918, the Sedition Act was created. Which is not my story to tell, so hey Olivia! Some major changes can be found in the document from 1789 to 1917, and one can be found in this quote directly from the document itself. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the United States or naval forces, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordinating nation disloyalty, immunity, or refusal of deputy in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. This basically states that anybody who has made false convictions about the military or naval forces can be sentenced to imprisonment, or has any information about the military or naval forces that could be released to the public. Which was a great thing from the standpoint of the government, but I think they kind of forgot about these things called the amendments, which if you passed 5th grade social studies, then you probably know what those are too. But if you don't, the First Amendment states that as a citizen of the United States, we get the right to free speech and the freedom of press. In this situation, however, Congress had completely set aside these facts and published a document anyways in hopes to protect our country in the war. But the act limited what people were able to say about the war and about how the military and naval forces were run, which angered a lot of people in society. The government, however, in this time of dire need, didn't listen to the cries of the public. Instead, they published the act and used it against people in court. One very famous example is the 1918 case of Debs versus the United States. According to my research, Debs was a leader of the Socialist Party of America in Ohio, Canton, Ohio, to be exact. He gave a speech whilst protesting in which he praised people who had refused to serve in the military. For giving this speech, Debs was arrested and charged under the Espionage Act. But luckily, he went to 5th grade and he knew his amendment rights. And was like, you can't do that. I get the right to free speech. And the government was all like, guess what? We don't care. And the convictions that he had been charged for were upheld. Lastly, one of the most famous espionage cases was Schneck versus the United States. Charles T. Schneck was the General Secretary of the United States Socialist Party. This group opposed military draft. They handed out pamphlets that told any man who had been drafted to resist it. Schneck was arrested on 3 counts of violating the Espionage Act. On top of that, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Arguments were heard on January 9th, 1919. His counsel argued that the Espionage Act violated the Constitution and that Schneck was using the freedom of speech granted by the First Amendment. Despite his efforts to defend himself, on March 3rd, Schneck's convictions were upheld. In conclusion, it was a law that was created to punish anyone who had something false to say about the military or naval forces or was working against these government-funded forces. Although this act was controversial throughout the public, it was published anyways in order to try and protect the government against any false publicity during World War I. The act was used against people in court and caused many individuals to be put in prison or fined for exercising their right to free speech and freedom of press. And lastly, which I didn't quite mention before, the Espionage Act was repealed in 1921, although some aspects of it do remain in government